Hi, I'm Caroline. I'm an artist and researcher. I'm a postdoctoral fellow with the Data Protection and Privacy Regulator of the UK called the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, as well as an artist in residence with the European Media Awards. So I've been embedded with IMCULT in Helsinki, looking at feminist data and alternative uses of social network. And one of the ways I describe my practice is this. So my background is originally in photojournalism, and I have a master's in design and technology. And I see everything through the lens of legibility and research storytelling. These are skills I honed as a photojournalist, and so with these skills, I make art and I do human rights research, focusing through the lens of how design and technology affect people in their everyday lives. And so this talk is really trying to unpack how we can see and understand data, the complexities of data, and how data, I think, regardless of how it's captured, will always have different kinds of hidden biases, agendas, but then also within that, their own stories. And I also want to address the issues within data, and a way to do that is perhaps to better understand what data is. And just so we're also all on the same page, I think it's important to sort of point out that technology and data are extremely interlinked. They're not necessarily panaceas or cure-alls. Data and technology are mirrors of society, and thus inequity that exists within society. But I do think we can use data as a way to try to confront or comment on, or at least document, forms of that inequity. And this is where I turn to the work of Andrew Gettleman, who's a data visualizer, who has a book called Raw Data is an Oxymoron. And this is how Andrew describes data, and I think it's a pretty accurate descriptor. Data, like tech, is sometimes described as extremely neutral, but it can be sometimes anything but that. Data is collected by people. Sometimes people have agendas, but all people have blind spots. Data can be collected without consent, like CCTV cameras filming our everyday moments. But even if we are being empathetic, data can also be collected by those that sometimes have time constraints. A project is due, information is needed, a survey needs to close. Data collection is constrained by humanity and living, by timelines, money, and deadlines. And so I say that so we can all understand the reality of data collection, given that data is the backbone of so many things, which is why I love Gettleman's quote. A neutral and thus incomplete definition of data is units of information. But Gettleman's quote goes further. Data is units of information in aggregate form that is the bedrock of modern policy decisions by authorities, governments, and non-governments alike. So data, even under the best circumstances, can be collected and still be imperfect. And I think it's always important to remember that, in a sense. Data is never complete or on its own. Data is always evolving, can always be researched further. And even a data set we have, again, under the best circumstances, it's always important to acknowledge its incompleteness. Because data, again, is this backbone for so many things like policy, machine learning, technology, and decision making. And in that way, data is always inherently political. In fact, I think it would be hard to ever call it neutral. And so going further, Gettleman's book also gets into this idea of subjective data versus raw data. That, in fact, all data, in a way, is subjective. And that affects us, the visualizers, technologists, policymakers, collectors, and artists. And so much of what is being collected, we're not even perhaps sure all the time exactly what is. It's nearly impossible, for example, for us to opt out of things like data collection. And I'm sure for some of you in this room, this may feel like things you've heard before. I always like to start presentations in a way sort of trying to set a baseline of information and knowledge around things like data collection. One of the points I really like that Gettleman brings up in his work is talking about this idea of raw data versus cooked data. And in fact, all data is effectively cooked. There is no such thing as raw data. Whenever we collect data, we're already creating containers and structures for it. We create decisions and buckets and names before we even have the data itself. So because of that, the inherent nature of data, that it has to exist in a structure, that it has to exist in a container, it's never actually raw. Data only exists once recorded, and thus it is cooked. So I present all of that to sort of talk about how can we think about introducing feminism and intersectionality into a data process. So what matters, like how we capture and cook data matters, but so do how we visualize and show that data to communities and audiences. And both these have to be in conversation with each other. This is where I turn to the work of Abigail Echo Hawk, who is a chief research officer with the Seattle Indian Health Board in the United States, who's working on decolonizing data to better serve her community. Oh, there we go. Sorry, there was a GIF that was supposed to be playing. And I really love this statement that Abigail Echo Hawk presents. So I'll read it out loud for those who are online if you can't see it. When we think about data and how it's gathered, that from marginalized communities, it's never gathered to help or serve us. It's primarily done to show the deficits in our communities, to show where there are gaps. And it's always done from a deficit-based framework. They talk about how our communities have the highest rates of obesity, the highest rates of diabetes, the highest rates of infant mortality. How are people maybe experiencing high rates of opioid misuse? And so Echo Hawk here is referring explicitly to her community in Seattle of Indigenous Native Americans. And one of the things she's striving to do with her work is introduce more community-based and participatory research into this process of how can you, when the community is working with data gatherers, help not just highlight the gaps, but understand perhaps the strengths of the community. How can you reflect that in the stories that are told and represented in even the journalism and media surrounding this particular community? And I think that that's extremely important because I think this next slide also really goes to the heart of what she's trying to talk about. That decolonizing data means the community itself is the one determining what the information they want from us to gather, who is gathering it and who's interpreting it. And so part of working with a community, and I would argue even hiring from the community to work on data gathering, sort of introduces this new means of decolonizing, of what are the data points that are being gathered and how are these the focus groups. And when that data set is gathered, how can you ensure that it's also returned to the community and used by the community in a way? And I think that this is an important part of data collection, especially in a human rights context. We need to gather data. Data is a form of witnessing, but how can we also work with communities to ensure that the data we gather can also be used by them and returned to them? And I think that's a lot of the work that Abigail Echo Hawk is trying to do up in Seattle, and that's something that I think we should reflect more into different data practices, particularly in policy and human rights. And so one of the things she highlights is this idea of being the other. In the United States, for example, Native Americans are less than 1% of the population. In terms of a data practice, less than 1% is often described as statistically insignificant. That means that large communities of people are not actually being shown in the data. So what she's referring to here is this idea that when a population is quote unquote statistically insignificant, that is a form of harm. And that part of her work is trying to highlight why do different groups, in this case she's referring to Pacific Islanders and Indigenous Native Americans group together when they're extremely different groups. And so I think that that's an inherent issue when we think of the current data visualization paradigm. That there are, at times, ways we have to combine groups, but it's important to think about why we are doing that. How does that serve the data? How does that change the outcome of that data set? How does that change the how does that change the insights we're pulling from this data set? So how can we honor the fact that in a data set about people, every single data point is an individual person? How can we sort of honor those lived experiences? And that's some of the work that Abigail Echo Hawk is doing through thinking about decolonizing data. So a way around that is perhaps thinking, if groups are grouped together as an other, how can you actually separate those groups out? What are insights you can pull from the individual groups? Can you introduce qualitative research or interviews to help highlight the different kinds of experiences those groups are facing? This is where I like to think about context analysis and choice in my own work. And so this is where, as a data practitioner, I turn to a few different things, which is intersectionality, data feminism, ideas of participatory design, and ethical ethnography. Because to humanize data, as a data practitioner, I need to tell accurate stories that reflect the lived experiences of the communities I'm working with. And I should work with those communities to tell those stories better. So I want to introduce the data feminism principles. This is something I use in my work. This is from their white paper. Data feminism is a methodology and series of principles created by Lauren Klein and Catherine D'Ignacio, two professors in the United States. And I try to think of these as like different kinds of steps I can embrace. And for this presentation, I'll unpack them. So rethinking binaries is, I think, very basically thinking about how do we communicate the limits of our categories in the final representation of data. So understanding that we at times have to make categories. What are the limitations of those categories? How can we best show that through something like data visualization, for example? And in ways, how can we allow users or audiences to refactor the categories we've presented for review? That could be an interactive data visualization where you allow people to sort of see how those categories could change or other ways that they could be grouped, for example. But I think it's incredibly important to think about just what are some of these main classifications that we'll use inside of data sets. How can we embrace pluralism? Pluralism refers to Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, which, similar to data feminism, calls for a new way of thinking of how to engage with technology. So pluralism is a step beyond rethinking the binary and suggests that we embrace the lead to openness and encourage pluralism and indefinites. What that really means, I think, is pluralism is asking for multiple viewpoints and perhaps acknowledging many facets of a data set. So the view, it's to confront this idea of the view from nowhere. The view from nowhere here is referring to pretending like everything is the same or that we aren't speaking from a particular context. So again, I think it's acknowledging how a data set perhaps was captured, perhaps where it was collected, who worked on it, the time constraints one was facing, as opposed to presenting a data set just as an object that appeared out of nowhere. This one is also incredibly important, which is examining power and aspiring to empowerment. And I think one of these ways is thinking about how can the visualization empower an end user or community, group, or organization? Can the data set itself be a comment on power or acknowledge the power structures it exists in? Perhaps the data set itself, let's say in a spreadsheet, may not be able to do that, but how we show and visualize the data and how we represent the data can. And relatedly, we have considering context. In data visualization, what I like to sort of think about with this one is what can we learn if we were to show, again, messy data? Perhaps more of that just recently gathered data. How do we take into a context this kind of messiness in the assessments of visualizations and how we create data visualizations? Is there a way to add in this local context? And I think that can be added in through things like research reports or the data visualization itself. How can you sort of elevate that with a form of data storytelling, perhaps? And this is, I think, commenting on specifically the output of data visualization. How can we think about tactile, experimental, or social ways of assessing data visualization? Those could be ways towards legitimizing embodiment and affect. And lastly, we have make labor visible. And I think Klein and D'Ignacio say this best in their paper, so I'll read out their quote. Information design processes often start with data, but a feminist approach would insist that we begin by working backwards to surface the actors, both individual and institutional, that have labored to generate a particular data set. Starting with the questions of data provenance helps to credit the bodies that make the visualization possible, the bodies that collect the data, that digitize them, that clean them, and maintain them. A feminist approach to visualization can help render visible the bodies that shape and care for data at every step of the process. This relates to the concept of Provence rhetoric, in which the authors sort of narrate visualization and cite data sources and methods that as a way to help build credibility with the audience. So I think that this is incredibly important when we again think of where do data sets come from and what was all the work that went into them. Because it can be an incredibly arduous process, right, to make data about something. And the hands that touch that data set should be honored. And so the work of Klein and Ignacio really impacts the way I think about my own data practice. I work a lot in online gender-based violence and data protection and privacy, so I'm often generating really specific and also highly important data sets where I'm working with people where a level of anonymity is often required. And so the data feminism principles shape different kinds of research methodologies that I work through that I would love to show y'all. So these are different questions I ask myself. And again, as I said earlier, every data point is a real person's lived experience, and that's incredibly true with things like online harassment. How can I best honor and respect what a person has experienced? But also, how does context impact what I'm researching? In online harassment, sometimes harassment is very much tied to a person's particular identity, and at times also the platform they're on. Twitter has a different kind of communication style than something like Instagram or Facebook or TikTok. And sometimes harassment or particular kinds of harassment are very specific to the platform that it's on. So how can I sort of have this input, right? These are all the different inputs I'm thinking about when I start to collect data and how I will visualize and show that data. For example, when I worked with Amnesty International on their Troll Patrol Twitter toxicity report in 2018, we found that Black women experienced more harassment than any other counterparts. And we were just studying Twitter and journalists and politicians based in the US and UK, so a very narrow group. But even still, that idea of intersectionality really played into how are we going to visualize and look at this data. And this was incredibly integral in shaping our research study. This is just a methodology I've come up with in the ways that I think about, again, dealing with things like traumatic data or harassment data. That all data needs a framework, guidelines, and parameters, and a structure, and harassment data is no different. I rely on pre-existing research, policy definitions from social networks, regulatory frameworks, and human rights standards, as well as policy directives from groups working specifically in online gender-based violence. And then I try to break harassment down into how is it rendered inside of a data set. So there are variables I think about like time, frequency, location, so on which platform, type of harassment, is there a coordination of harassment, and then type of harassment / threat level. So is someone being sent a tweet? Is it directed at an aspect of their identity? And then what is the actual sort of verbiage or language used? And then is there another level of harassment? So is it something that would like direct information about them where there's an immediate security concern? And these are the different kinds of data methods I used, which is mixed methods, to help provide context and to humanize and further build out the problem. And so all of this is also present in a project of mine called Feminist Data Set. And this is an art project. I'm going to switch gears slightly. That's inspired by my online harassment work and work in gender-based violence and technology. And so Feminist Data Set, also deeply inspired by data feminism, started in 2017 as a response to the many documented problems and cases in technology machine learning. So it's an art project that is using intersectional feminism as a framework to investigate and then create interventions in every step of the machine learning pipeline. And this project is inspired by Arte Utile, xenofeminism, and APC's feminist principles of the internet. And these are the kinds of things that we've been surfacing out of the Feminist Data Set project. Part of this is understanding how can we gather feminist data, again, sitting on top of the methodologies of data feminism. And how can we create data sets that allow for consent, transparency, refusal, and accountability? And related to that, another thing we start to wonder is, should data sets decay and have time limits? Should a data set gathered 5 years ago perhaps only be used for 10 years? How can we control or think about who uses our data set in a way that aligns with feminist values? So thinking about refusal. How does our work together on a data and technology project reflect feminist values? Meaning, how does our actual collaboration itself embody a feminist principle? How does our project also have a way to ensure feminist values in research, reflecting on how many ethical AI teams have been hindered by the exact company they work for? So how can we create a space with the stakeholders we're working with to ensure that the outputs of our research are actually allowed to be published and to be looked at and engaged with? How can we ensure participatory action and center community knowledge? And how many checks, tests, and audits do we need to continually ensure safety? This is a big part. Very often we're going back continually and looking at our projects, specifically in machine learning, as constantly testing and checking for different levels of bias and harm. And I see this as a feminist part of making with technology, that like the work that we do of ensuring safety is never done. And so this to me is a big part of making with feminist values, that we're constantly thinking about harm reduction and greeting that not as a problem, but as like a value that we're centering. This is another example of feminist data set. It's extremely process driven, and so the project itself actually manifests as workshops on data and machine learning. And the workshops are key because they provide a way for communities to think through what intersectional, community-driven, equitable data collection could look like. In the workshops, we talk about Professor Kimberly Crenshaw's work, the creator of the term intersectionality. We also start to unpack, well, how does intersectionality manifest in data, or for example, in writing, since the feminist data set is a text-based data set. For example, let's look at an article about income inequality. An intersectional feminist article would highlight that white women, black women, indigenous women, Latina women, and trans women are all paid different amounts. So an article that represents all women as a monolith is not intersectional and cannot be in the data set. Within our workshops, community members then research and submit written data, be it poems, texts, blogs, or transcripts. The only time my hand as the creator appears is to remove non-intersectional data. And feminist data set operates in a similar vein to this critical design project here called Thomas Thwaites Toaster Project, in which Thwaites builds a commercial toaster from scratch. Effectively, I'm doing something similar with machine learning. I'm rebuilding a machine learning process entirely in a way by hand. So it's taking a critical and artistic view on software and machine learning. My output will probably be as misshapen as this project, but the point is more to look at what kinds of interventions and checks and balances do we need inside the machine learning process, and how can that be folded in to others working with machine learning. So a current project of mine is called TRK, or Technically Responsible Knowledge. And it's an open source project that is examining wage inequality and creates open source alternatives to data labeling and training in AI. It's a part of the Feminist Dataset project. So part of what I've been looking at is the issues around labor and invisibility and the creation and maintaining of data structures, and how do you generate algorithmic models from data under a feminist lens. TRK was funded by the Mozilla Foundation in 2019 and was created with Cade Diem, Ian Arnaud-Fuma, and Rainbow Unicorn. What you see here is a wage calculator trying to highlight some of the missing gaps we noticed on platforms like Crowdflower, Fiverr, and Mechanical Turk. I even became a Mechanical Turk myself for 2 months during this project. One of the big things that's missing in terms of thinking about how do you price equitably inside of spaces like Mechanical Turk is time. So feminist value would be thinking about how are you allowing someone to work on a project where they're paid fairly and also given enough time to complete the project without there being a massive time constraint. This is a major issue inside of microservice projects. So with these sliders, you can adjust and look at the different time levels. From a series of tests I ran on myself, this is how we sort of came up to like what a minimum time should be. Additionally, we also created an open source alternative to Mechanical Turk. Any of you can use our platform or download the code and use it yourself, so you don't have to use Mechanical Turk. And part of this was I started thinking about, again, this idea of the labor behind a project. So as someone who uses AI as an art material to explore and make art, I was struck by how many startups and research labs and artists use Mechanical Turk-style platforms without any thought given to the payment structure determined for workers on that platform. Mechanical Turk and similar platforms have had well-documented cases of horrendous worker-related issues, such as severely underpaid contracts. And again, as I noticed, if many instances, if a lab or individual is trying to price equitably, the interface of Mechanical Turk often works against it. And so if we think of the machine learning pipeline as perhaps death by 1,000 cuts, I think of this project as one small Band-Aid for one small cut. Because so many issues related to machine learning are issues of a more deeper ingrained societal inequity that can only be addressed, I think, through large shifts in restructuring in society or legislation. But as a designer and researcher, I try to look at what kinds of research work can help alleviate or expose those issues. Part of the design thinking behind TRK is to try to examine the equity and transparency within interfaces and the design of tools and what problems tool design, UX, and UI create in technology. So inspired by the data sheets for datasets white paper, TRK injects plain text information into the dataset with information that includes a description about what the dataset is, when it was made, why it was made, and who worked on it. Again, similar to data feminism, how do you elevate context and show the labor? How do you elevate varying forms of embodiment? Design, much like technology, isn't neutral, so as an artist, I try to use design as a material to confront and comment on the slickness and inequity of for-profit technologies. Just gonna go ahead. Here we go. This is something I've been thinking a lot about, is the role of design in terms of impacting technology. Design isn't just a skill, but a practice and a language in and of itself. Design is often what can take policy and code and turn it into an understandable interface for users. Design can be the thing that explains what code and policy are outlining if we look at things like online harassment reporting or security settings. And so design is incredibly important when we start thinking about issues of inequity related to data and technology. So all of this previous research and artwork is related to how I think about transparency and machine learning when I put on my human rights researcher hat. Algorithmic justice and data protection is the key area my traditional research work focuses on, and it's very much influenced by thinking about feminist interventions and intersectionality related to both design and data. And so this is a methodology I came up with for when I'm thinking about different kinds of interventions or product design related to data and machine learning. So a feminist-informed version of transparency would include things like legibility, the ability to audit, and how do you create spaces for user feedback, so impact and interaction. And using design to actually explain what's happening inside of an algorithm, a data model, and a product. Legibility is using plain language in what a product and algorithm is doing, something long championed in the civic technology spaces. So legibility can show or explain what is in a data set and how it's used. So I call this data ingredients. And this is sort of building on a lot of work that is sort of existing in the data legibility space of should data sets have ratings and explanations and labels that explain why the data set was made and how it will be used inside of spaces like machine learning. Hold on. There we go. Awesome. So drugs, for example, in the United States have approval processes. They are tested. Food packaging has ingredients and calorie information. While this isn't perfect, I think we should be thinking about ratings and accountability for data. What if algorithms came with this kind of labeling? There's, again, I mentioned this sort of big movement around this. And this is, again, thinking about how can our end users really understand their spaces in technology inside of data sets and how their data is used, for example, inside of a larger product. For example, this potentially could be our future. And let's imagine this framework perhaps more in action. I'll give you a personal example. I went through a really bad breakup in 2015, and I listened to a band that is really awful, and I'm really ashamed of it, but I'll share it with you. How many of you have heard of Mumford & Sons? No? Yeah? I don't know if that's big over here. It's not a great band. It's a really embarrassing band to admit on stage. And I listened to that for an entire month. That's actually all I listened to. And I ruined my Spotify account and my Discover Weekly. I had overtrained Spotify's recommendation algorithm to just give me Mumford & Sons stuff. And that was 7 years ago. Ooh. What is going on? I guess, I guess they don't like Mumford & Sons either, or Spotify. I mean, I don't know. I feel bad if there's a Mumford & Sons fan in here. I apologize. But the point of that was more 7 years ago, I overtrained the recommendation algorithm, and I can't change anything about it now. And so I present this as an innocuous example, but why can't I intervene in that product? I'm so afraid now that like another sound's gonna come out. Why can't I intervene in something like Spotify, right? It's an entertainment product. Why can't I see how my data is used? Why can't I say the data that I find meaningful, right? And the way that I think this relates to intersectionality in feminist thinking and technology is it's around user agency, that ability to audit and impact something. So why can't I tell a system like what I care about? And why can't I see more of this information that I'm curious about? So this is where I'm talking about, where we think about a legible process, right? A way for me to see what's happening and a way to audit, to understand how it's used, and then make an impact and change to the system. It would make my experience so much better. And again, I think that this is what makes it a form of thinking about feminist technology. And I know we're running short on time, but I also want to show how I take that same thinking and apply it to things like social media recommendation algorithms for transparency. So over this summer, I got to work with the Center for Democracy and Technology on thinking about a series of interventions and a prototype on how to make social media recommendation algorithms more transparent and allow for user agency. So the CDT team, the Center for Democracy and Technology, led by Mikkel Lura, they used co-design and co-research with a group of users to try to surface what they were actually interested in. Then as the designer, I had to take all those points the users cared about and think about how can I sort of surface and structure this in a way related to transparency and explainable AI. And so some of that is these data points really come out of what the users said they were interested in. They wanted to know what data was collected, how it was collected, and also how it was being used. Part of this meant, as a designer, I had to think about how do I explain this really complex data to them. So maybe I can take them on a journey through their data. A user may not remember like how many comments they posted, but they may remember like accounts they started following or new followers they gained, or maybe that they traveled during that time period. So part of what I have to do here is think about how can I explain this and take a user on this journey of their data in a way that is both straightforward and also really kind to the user. How can I ground them in that data? This also leads us to prototype 2, inferences about their experience. So assumptions and inferences the platform is making about them. And this is one thing that users were extremely, extremely curious about. What we see here are showing examples of hard data, like someone's location. But let's say you click on political affiliation. This is where I mean having this sort of granular breakdown that mimics the first design screen that the users saw. We're hoping to ground them in the visual language of this. So everything is trying to reinforce things they've seen before to really, really make this as legible as possible so they can really understand the data they're looking at. So in this one, they may remember joining a group. Maybe they, again, don't remember the amount of content they've clicked on. I don't know anyone that has an exact number that they can remember of content they clicked on. I can't. But they probably remember some of the URLs they've read. And again, they can probably remember different people that they've interacted with. And so the goal of this was to show granular things without overwhelming people in the data, but allowing them to explore things maybe like political ads or URLs they've read and see how that informs the recommendation algorithm itself. So really thinking about this data in context. For time, I'll just quickly go forward. We also created a plug and play where people could change aspects about themselves to see how that then impacted the algorithm. And this came out of a lot of the work I did at IBM Watson as a design researcher on natural language processing APIs. One of the best ways to sort of show or explain AI is to actually let people touch and play with things and really see how that impacts exactly what they're seeing. And so you see that again here. They've changed like one aspect or a few aspects of their identity. You can see how some of the ads and content change. And this last one I think is one of the more important ones and also the most speculative. I think it's important to remember, I think it's important to recommend in this case, because we were functioning as like a think tank and a research group, what are the things we would like to see embodied by major platforms? And this is one of those ones, because it also, again, is coming directly out of what the users requested. They wanted an ability to control who has access to their data, and also see which parts of their data were available to different groups. They also want to see how data that's not on the platform influences the algorithmic model, which is this top part. And the second part is allowing them to move things around in terms of who can access what kinds of data. Now, to be totally transparent, I think if we were designing this for a real product, it wouldn't look like this. We would probably do something really different. But the goal of this was to sort of visually show, and we user tested this multiple times with the users so they could to see how well they would understand it. But the goal is to just sort of show that all different data could be moved around with different levels of privacy, that privacy is not a binary. And again, the way that I think this relates back to a feminist data practice is this idea of allowing for user agency and control, and also clearly explaining and outlining what you're doing with data, why and how that relates back to the person. And so this is, I think, one of the key insights, I think, from my work and what I want to leave with y'all is data sets and projects must be designed to be understandable, to create consent-based design, to allow for privacy and user protection. And this is what I think is a feminist-informed way of looking at policy and technology. And I'm sure I'm over time, but thank you so much.